let's step past the assumptions of our modern world for just a moment. I want you to transport yourself into the actual sensory reality of a medieval city. Just imagine it: the narrow, winding streets, the constant hum of labor, that sharp tang of wood smoke in the air, and just this dense press of humanity all around you. For generations, we've been fed a very specific story about how ordinary people in the Middle Ages lived. It's usually a story of profound ignorance, endless filth, and basically a complete disregard for human survival. But when we actually look at the historical, archaeological, and legal evidence, a radically different picture emerges. In this explainer, we're going to reconstruct the actual daily life of medieval urban dwellers. We'll explore not just how they survived, but how they ingeniously managed the massive environmental pressures of their rapidly growing cities.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Consider what is probably the single most pervasive cinematic myth about the Middle Ages. You know the one, the hapless pedestrian walking down a chaotic street only to get completely drenched by the contents of a chamber pot, flung carelessly out of a second-story window. It's a super vivid image, right? But as an actual representation of daily medieval life, it is fundamentally flawed. We really have to ask ourselves, would any civilized community actually tolerate that kind of behavior on a daily basis? When you compare that cinematic myth to the actual historical reality, the difference is just staggering. Medieval towns were definitely not lawless, chaotic mud pits. They were actually incredibly complex, highly regulated societies that actively managed the urban environment. I mean, they relied on really strict legal frameworks to deal with waste. The fines for illegal dumping, they could literally ruin you financially. In fact, historical records even tell the story of an outraged mob severely beating a stranger just because he dropped a smoked fish skin in their street. Crazy, right? But why do they care so much? Because those local residents absolutely refused to be held responsible for the heavy municipal fine that his sheer laziness was going to incur. So in a community governed by that kind of strict shared accountability, casually dumping a bucket of excrement out of your window? Utterly unthinkable. So to understand why they cared so deeply about cleanliness, we really need to understand the constraints of their science. Look, medieval people obviously didn't know about bacteria or germ theory, but they absolutely 100% knew that waste was dangerous. They operated under something called miasma theory. This was the prevailing medical belief that disease was directly caused and spread by foul odors, vapors, and corrupted air. Under this paradigm, bad smells weren't just gross, they were literally lethal. So keeping excrement and rotting waste far away from your living space was a literal matter of life and death. Honestly, tossing your waste out the window would mean smelling it every single time you opened your shutters. You'd be directly inviting disease right into your home. It just made absolutely no sense based on their understanding of public health. And this brilliantly illustrates the geographic reality of those cities. Waterways, like the River Ouse in York, created intense friction within these communities. I mean, running water was the absolute lifeblood of the city. You needed it for drinking, for brewing, for transportation. But at the same time, it was the primary engine for industry. So you have this intense friction of a multiple-use river. Everyday citizens desperately required clean water downstream, while water-demanding and highly polluting crafts had to set up shop upstream. Because of this, the city council basically found itself constantly playing referee between the absolute need for safe drinking water and the economic necessity of these noxious urban industries. And speaking of noxious industries, absolutely no trade created a more severe environmental crisis than leather making. Leather was essential for medieval life. They used it for clothing, harnesses, military gear, you name it. But the actual art of tanning, it was a gruesome sensory nightmare. Just imagine the reality of this process. First, tanners had to wash the hides completely free of blood and flesh. Then, to loosen the animal hair, they'd soak those skins in massive vats of alkaline lime or stale urine. Next, to make the leather flexible, they treated it with bird guano or alkaline dog dung, and finally soaked it in an acidic oak bark liquor for up to a whole year. This massive, unimaginably foul-smelling operation required huge amounts of water, and it produced a highly toxic biological runoff that was routinely dumped straight back into the river. As you can imagine, that completely terrified the downstream residents. And those downstream residents did not just sit there and take it. They fought back. In York, the local butchers were in the habit of washing their slaughtered entrails in the river at a place called Pudding Holes, which happened to be right next to a Franciscan friary. Well, the monks did not passively accept this at all. They actually launched a major legal battle. In 1372, they complained directly to King Edward III, stating that the air in their church was literally poisoned by the stench, breeding flies and vermin, and basically driving their entire congregation away. And it worked. The king and the local government intervened, aggressively enforcing zoning laws and slapping heavy fines on those butchers. It completely proves that ordinary medieval people demanded clean air and water, and they actually knew how to use the legal system to protect their environment. So, if all this waste couldn't just be dumped in the river or the street, where on earth did it actually go? Well, local governments transitioned from just reacting to chaos to actively engineering urban order. By 1421, town councils in cities like Coventry were aggressively zoning their urban spaces. They mandated very specific alternative waste sites by establishing designated public muck hills just outside the city gates, places like Greyfriar Gate and Newgate. They even funded municipal cleaning departments, creating a highly organized system to ensure that all this waste was systematically and safely removed from the densely populated urban core.
The entire landscape was bound by strict environmental law. Waste disposal definitely wasn't some private matter. It was a highly regulated public affair that was central to the moral and physical order of a functioning city. Just look at the rules. In Coventry, dumping in the river carried a massive 20-shilling fine. Way back in 1269 in Ribe, Denmark, the laws dictated exactly how far a private latrine had to be from a street or a cemetery, down to the foot. In Bergen, Norway, you couldn't build a latrine within 2 feet of a neighbor's property line, just to prevent any nasty seepage. City councils even legally mandated street sweeping on rainy days. Why? So that the storm runoff would flush debris down the natural slopes and out through specific drainage openings in the city walls. They really thought this through. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that the physical evidence of this civic planning actually still survives today. You can see it in the architectural remnants of overhanging public latrines, like these ones on the Rosenkranz Tower in Bergen. While a lot of private homes use deep, stone-lined cesspits in their backyards, cities were also investing heavily in permanent public facilities. They deliberately engineered these structures right over tidal estuaries or fast-moving waterways, so the natural currents would safely wash all the deposits far away from the population. It was practical, large-scale municipal sanitary engineering in action. But for the thousands of ordinary homes with private enclosed cesspits, gravity and water just weren't enough. The solid waste naturally built up over time, which required the services of the true unsung heroes of the medieval era, the gong farmers. These guys were highly specialized, nocturnal professionals. Literally, by law, they were only permitted to work the midnight shift, usually between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. Operating solely by lantern light, they would dig out these deep, foul-smelling cesspits by hand, load the waste into buckets, and cart it through the quiet, sleeping city to those designated dumps outside the walls. They were literally the essential backbone of urban survival. Now, because this vital work was, as you can guess, universally despised by pretty much everyone, it paid exceptionally well. Back in the 15th century, gong farmers charged a highly lucrative rate of 2 shillings per ton of excrement removed. To put that kind of money into perspective for you, gong farmers working for Queen Elizabeth I a bit later on earned 6 pence a day, which actually secured them a very comfortable living. This heavy financial investment from both private citizens and city councils proves that waste management was never just ignored, it was a respected, heavily financed municipal necessity. Yet that high pay came with a genuinely terrible human cost. The physical realities of this job were incredibly deadly. Working deep underground in these confined, dark spaces, gong farmers faced constant exposure to terrible pathogens and the ever-present danger of asphyxiation from toxic fumes. And historical records document some truly genuine tragedies. Take the story of Richard the Raker in 1326. Richard was a gong farmer who tragically drowned when the rotting wooden ceiling of a massive cesspit suddenly collapsed right beneath him during a midnight shift. It's a really sobering reminder of the lethal risks that ordinary, working-class people endured just to keep their communities functional and clean. So, the crucial point here is what actually happened to all this waste once it left the city limits. Unlike our modern society, where we generally treat waste as useless garbage to be buried away in landfills and forgotten, the medieval world operated on a highly efficient circular economy. That night soil collected by the gong farmers, it was actually an incredibly valuable resource, packed with essential nitrogen and phosphorus. It was actively sold and redistributed to local farmers, who then spread it over the fields and market gardens just outside the city walls. The waste of the city literally fertilized the agrarian lands that in turn grew the food that fed the city. Literally nothing was truly wasted. When we finally strip away the Hollywood myths, we don't find a dark age full of passive victims just wallowing in filth. We find a brilliantly resilient civilization actively fighting back against the immense, crushing pressures of urban living. Sure, they completely lacked our modern technology and our microscopic understanding of disease, but through incredibly strict laws, complex civic engineering, and the grueling labor of ordinary people, they built sustainable systems to protect their communities. Their relentless battle against pollution actually holds up a fascinating mirror to our own modern struggles with urban metabolism, and it really leaves us to wonder, centuries from now, how will future generations judge the way we manage the environments of our own growing cities?